Just a little bit about the Green Economy Coalition. We came together first in 2009. I think that it was predominantly United Nations Environment Programme that really put green economy on the international map. And a lot of organisations, development and environment organisations, were concerned that green economy may be defined very narrowly, maybe just about energy policy or maybe just about food policy. And if this was genuinely about challenging the way we run our global economies, we should work together to keep the concept of green economy as broad as possible, and that it should address fundamental issues of poverty alleviation and how we look after our natural world. So very quickly, a group of mostly civil society organisations came together and said, well, let us work together to create a shared understanding of what green economy means, and then let us start to have those discussions in a broader sense. At the same time, Rio 2012 came along. For those of you, hopefully most of you will be familiar that Rio 2012 is the next Earth conference, and on that agenda, United Nations managed to put green economy, and that stimulated an awful lot of discussion amongst countries saying, well, what is this? Is it just another northern construct that's coming to tell us how to develop our country's economies, or is it something genuinely that will address poverty and looking after our environment? So we were all concerned about it, and our answer to that was, it's on the agenda. Let us see if we can influence this green economy definition to mean that it achieves some of the outcomes that we want to pursue, looking for respect and understanding of how the natural world works and protecting and living within environmental limits, really thinking about persistent poverty and ensuring we're addressing that, but also creating a development trajectory that recognises planetary limits and looks to share the benefits of economy more fairly and more widely. So tonight, I have the privilege of knowing a number of people in the audience and have worked with you over the years, and for those of you who haven't, I welcome you here. IIED is our host of the Green Economy Coalition. We saw that green economy meant a number of different things, 5 areas of change that we saw, and one of the most important was about governance. And governance that includes how we measure things, how we actually start to understand what are the priorities that we set at an international level, at national levels, and within our businesses. What are those priorities? How do we measure them? How do we report on them? And so we created this cluster that we call an opportunity narrative around measure what matters. And with us tonight we have a fantastic panel, and we're going to hear from Richard Matheson, the Chief Executive of TrueCost, about his experiences of developing the Measure What Matters agenda within the corporate world, particularly the work of Puma, I believe, and really starting to get that sense of where is this agenda up to on corporate reporting and what next for it. We're also going to hear from Theresa Fogel, who's Deputy Chief Executive of GRI. Hopefully most of you know GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, that's done a fantastic work over the years to really sensitise business to the idea of corporate reporting. Derek Osborne has become Farouk from Stakeholder Forum, so we're delighted that Farouk could stand in. Derek was unfortunately not able to join us for personal reasons. And we have Camilla, the Director of IIED. Derek, Farouk is going to talk to us about where the GDP Plus agenda is up to, and Camilla is going to talk to us about the IIED agenda. Okay, so in 4 months' time, Rio 2012, and on the agenda for Rio 2012 is both corporate reporting, beyond GDP agenda, and the new emergent hot favourite Sustainable Development Goals. And there is a potential risk that we will go into a period of horse trading between these different agendas, well, that one, or that one, or that one. And there are many organisations that are in our coalition that are particularly interested in corporate reporting, and there are those that are particularly interested in the beyond GDP, and those that are particularly interested in the SDGs. And this has forced us to really look at this agenda and say, okay, there is a great deal of value in driving the corporate reporting measures, But to a certain extent, when we've had this discussion with a number of our colleagues, the idea of a triple bottom line is better empowered if it sits, the business case for sustainability is better empowered if there's a societal case for sustainability. And what I mean by that is the triple bottom line works when there is a triple top line at a societal level. And that really drives the corporate, we reward corporations for their contributions to a healthy planet, or we contribute for their, to a more resilient and stable society. So the idea of beyond GDP was very attractive to us in complement to the corporate reporting agenda. So we were very keen that those two were there. And then the SDG agenda. And I think that one of the concerns that we always had with both the corporate reporting and the national reporting is this key word externalities. You can have externalities from a corporate, and you can have externalities from a nation, but at a global level, there is no externalities. They are costs. They are accumulating somewhere. And so the idea that at a global level, a global perspective was emerging, sustainable development goals should capture those externalities as global areas of concern. That was really attractive, because there are no externalities. This is a cost somewhere. This is an issue that we must tackle. So a global perspective of sustainable development goals would benefit setting objectives at the national level, where we would want to go at national priorities, how that contributes to national development, contributes to international development, and how this contributes to a corporate development. So we've described this whole program as Measure What Matters. And our idea tonight for discussion with you and with our panel is, where are these various agendas up to? And isn't there some benefit of thinking of these things not as separate measures, but as an integrated mindset for decision making at international, national, and corporate levels? That's our proposition to you. We hope that we have a robust and exciting and interesting discussion. And that's enough from me. I call upon our first speaker, Richard, who will tell us a little bit about where True Cost is engaged with this, and also Puma. Thank you very much, Richard.
Sure, thanks, Oliver. So I wanted to talk first about externalities, and then I go on and talk about the work that Puma did. Externalities are something that economists understand, and it was a phrase that I used a lot 10 years ago that no business person really truly understood, but is becoming much better understood today. Some of the best examples around externalities come out of some of the work that we've done for both TEEB and UNEP. So some of the work that we did for TEEB showed that, for example, if you look at China and you look at timber harvesting between 1948 and 1998, China earned a lot of money out of harvesting timber unsustainably, so clear felling in 19 provinces. And a significant thing happened in 1988, which is that the Yellow River dried up. Now that cost them $30 billion in 1 year to fix that problem. So that's an externality coming home to roost in 1 year. If you took that cost and you spread it over all the years and all the economic benefit that China gained, it would actually pretty much have wiped out the benefit they gained from harvesting the timber in the first place. So in other words, in not following a sustainable route, economically they suffered. So this is a real cost. This is not something that's a 2050 problem. This is a cost that we have today. We then did a piece of work for UNEP and for the United Nations backed Principles for Responsible Investment to see how that would apply in an investment context. So if you look at global externalities as a rough proxy, these are very difficult to look at, but as a rough proxy, global externalities amount to about $6.6 trillion. Which is about 20% more than the combined losses of OECD pension funds since 2008 as a consequence of the global financial crisis. So a bigger problem than we have today. And what this really means is our economy is going to be suppressed and more suppressed in the future. And corporates are responsible, the top 3,000 public listed companies are responsible for around a third of that damage, $2.2 trillion. So corporates are both causing some of the issues, and in fact, obviously, we as consumers are causing the issues ultimately, but corporates are causing the issues, and also corporates have the ability to address the issues, because somewhat corporates and companies operate in ways where the chief executive can make a decision, like the chief executive of Puma, which I'll go into in a little bit, and say we can actually change things for the better. We can understand the economic reality of what we're facing and address it more clearly. So then, coming on to China, if you look at China, and what China's done as a government is they've realised that the economic disaster they had as a consequence of the Yellow River drying up shouldn't be repeated. So they kicked off a number of different studies, and there's an interesting example that the Chinese government looked at, which is air pollution. So in 2005, air pollution cost China between 4 and 6% of GDP. So that's between 4 and 6% of GDP growth that's missing from China today. Now, the way they did that calculation was air pollution kills people, so dead people are not very productive, and so therefore they did that calculation on that basis to show that their economy is suffering. Now, fixing an air pollution problem really means fixing a climate change problem and fixing an energy security problem. So China, in my view, made a very clever move to set targets on climate change reduction, on carbon intensity reduction, and energy intensity reduction. So then coming to Puma, against that backdrop of evidence, there's quite a clear case for a chief executive of Puma who said, I read my sustainability report, it's fantastic, I'm not sure I fully understand all the language in that report, unfortunately. Why can't I have something that's extremely clear, that's presented to me as a businessman on one page that shows me the economic impact of my business and the economic impact that I might have to internalize in the future? Now the reality is, because of a drought in Russia in early 2011, late 2010, the price of wheat went up by 150%. That means the price of beef goes up as well, and Puma rely on leather. So in fact, the price of leather went up by 70% because wheat is a major feedstock for cattle ranching. And so companies in that sector have been suffering, their margins have been eroded. They haven't necessarily been able to connect it to a drought in Russia. So therefore, they've not necessarily had forward visibility, as we in the West have outsourced all our raw material production to organizations largely in developing countries. We've outsourced our ability to control that and understand it. And so therefore, having more visibility on that is very important. So the chief executive of Puma, Nicholas Zeitz, who was then the chief executive, now chairman, wanted this framework in place to help him understand the impact of his business and what he could do about it. Now, he's reported that the company, the business, has an environmental profit and loss statement of 145 million euros, which is quite a lot for their business. And we conducted this work along with PwC, and we studied a whole range of different externalities, and we applied them not only to Puma's operations, but also to their supply chain to show the impact of raw materials all the way through to tanneries, cut and sew factories, and all the way through to their operations. So now he has a framework to help him understand his business, and he's going through the business is going through the process of embedding that framework at different levels, from the design stage to strategic sourcing decisions, to decisions about hedging and pricing, for example, and decisions about how you might alter the customer proposition to gain benefit actually in the market and gain differentiation. So it's quite a broad approach, and it's not an easy approach. It's an approach that needs to be firmly embedded in business thinking. It's not just a marketing approach. But it's an interesting approach because it expresses the economic reality for their business today. They can actually look at their future cash flows and adjust them if they wish to. They can investigate different business models if they wish to. So I'll leave it there. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Puma and externalities. Thank you.
I mean, we want to make this as interactive as possible, but I think if we just kind of lay out the whole frame of this discussion up front of the panel, then we'll have much more opportunity for us for chatting. So if I may, I'd like to introduce Teresa Fogelberg from GRI. And again, Teresa, where is the corporate reporting up to? What are the opportunities really within the Rio process, and how are you thinking about this idea that Richard so clearly articulated, this relationship between corporate priorities, corporate reporting, national and even international priorities?
Well, thank you, Oliver, and thank you very much for inviting me here in this impressive venue or new building of IIED. And we just agreed that there would be no slides, so I'm fine without slides, because I think that's the format of the discussion. So why don't you turn the machine down? I also have to say that I'm very proud to be on the board of IIED, so it's I commend Oliver for his leadership of the Green Economy Coalition. I think you have done a marvelous job over the past years, and now we are getting really close to Rio, so I'm very excited about it. And it's also good to hear about Puma. Actually, Puma is one of the first companies that actually really made it made a requirement for all of its suppliers also to use GRI reporting in consistency with their own model of reporting. So now it's interesting to see how they use that and kind of transform that in a very easy cost benefit for the CEO. So that's really interesting. Now, this important meeting talks about measuring what matters, and when inviting us here, Oliver, you had three statements that you said on the first time. In the first place, measuring and reporting sustainability performance by company is very high on the agenda of Rio so far, and that is indeed correct. You also say that the current systems of reporting that exist both for the corporate sector, for national level, and for international level are inadequate, and I think that's correct as well. And then you say that there has been hardly any contact between these agendas: corporate reporting, national, so-called beyond GDP reporting, and the larger policy framework like this, Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that I'm a little bit less pessimistic than you are. I think that there are alignments that are really interesting. And I hope, I'm really also looking forward to listening to Camilla when you're going to address the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think they will be very important to actually build a larger strategic framework around these more hands-on practical things that we are discussing. And I also think that Rio is a huge opportunity for this, and governments like actually the United Kingdom have recognized this, and so has the Brazilian government. I think they also play a quite prominent role here. And you could already say that this is an achievement of the Green Economy Coalition led by you. We need metrics to be transformative, and if I talk from the corporate dimension, I think that why is this measuring and reporting feature, why has it appeared so prominently in the zero draft? Because it's a very specific text, and it's also one of the suggestions that has been made in the Rio text that is not talking in a more traditional mode about the thematic issues such as water, energy, poverty, and so on. So it's a very specific text which reads actually in the document The Future We Want. It reads: we call for a global policy framework requiring all listed and large private companies to consider sustainability issues and to integrate sustainability information within the reporting cycle. So that means that not only should all companies report, but government actually should develop a policy framework by developing legislation or soft law to have all companies do this. Well, why is it so prominent in the Rio agenda? And I think that is, I think there's a very simple reason for that, because I think there is now a global recognition that in order to manage a transformation to a green and sustainable economy, we do need information on environmental, social, and economic performance of companies, because companies are such important entities. 20 years ago, way back in Rio '92, we created the framework conventions on climate, biodiversity, and desertification, and these were very important global agendas, but there the actors were governments, were states, and I think that there's a kind of global agreement that although the role of governments remains very, very important, it should never be underestimated that now it's time for companies to perform. So it's a very, you could say, a very simple statement, and this was already recognized in Johannesburg, and over the last 10 years since Johannesburg, there has been a huge flight to sustainability reporting. And that means that the issue itself has become much more professionalized. So instead of sustainability reporting being done by an expert or by a consultant who is hired from outside, it has been an issue that has become very professionalized and has moved to mainstream and to the boardroom. And I think you gave an interesting example of Puma, and what we also see, which is a very recent trend, is there's now a whole movement that sustainability information should be integrated into the annual report of companies as well, what we call the integrated reporting movement. Whereas there are also, of course, thousands of companies that say, yes, we want to integrate it into our general report, but we also need for specific readers groups, for consumers, for investors, for employees, we also need kind of parallel narrative and measurement of what, which goes a bit deeper than a chapter in an annual report. But this demonstrates how mainstream this practice has become and how it actually has raised also within the corporate business itself from a kind of special consultant to the boardroom. And so there is a critical mass now. There are about 6,000 companies in the world that issue sustainability reports. And this is not a Western phenomena. We see in the developing countries, not only in the large emerging market economies, but also in other countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam. We see a very steep increase in Nigeria, strangely enough, over the last few years, a huge increase in companies reporting on their sustainability performance. But if we look at the figures, there are, according to UN definitions, there are 82,000 multinationals, and 6,000 out of 82 is of course a small minority. Although amongst those 6,000 companies, 95%, for instance, of the global 250 issue sustainability reports. So for the largest companies in the world, it has really become, you could say, de facto mandatory to report. So that is maybe the reason, this critical mass argument, the argument that it has really become mainstream, it has become a board issue, it has become an issue where investors are asking for, rating agencies are asking, if they look at the risk of a company, they are asking for this kind of information. So in that sense, it really has become mainstream. And last but not least, if you look at the negotiations in Rio, you can look at all these ideal strategic objectives, which sound maybe a bit fluffy, and this is a very hands-on objective to say, okay, let's all agree in Rio that there should be a kind of policy framework on reporting. It's something very concrete that governments can go home with and start applying. So that is what the Green Economy Coalition has been asking for, has been pleading for, that such a policy framework should exist. And Aviva has also played a very important role bringing on board a lot of other investors to actually to go and talk to them, but also to governments and say, from an investor perspective, this is so important. This becomes actually something that all companies should do. And the concept that is used, and I think it's a really smart concept, is what we call the report or explain principle. Because, in today's geopolitical climate, it's of course very difficult to get new laws or regulation through, or legally binding conventions like the Climate Change Convention. I mean, a lot of people think that a legally binding convention for the corporate sector would be a bridge too far. So the report or explain principle is very smart because, first of all, it is known in the corporate governance legislation in quite a few countries, and on the other hand, it is also quite flexible in the sense that if a company can still choose to say, we do not want to report or we are not able to report, but they do have to state that, and then they have to explain why they do not want to report about sustainability. And that has happened in Denmark. So there are a few big countries, Denmark, Norway, where they actually now have a national legislation where companies have to do this, and they have now had several impact studies of what does it mean in terms of practice for companies, and they have seen that the first year there were hundreds of companies that was like, sustainability, why should we do something with this? But because it was mandatory, they actually started looking at it, and then in those 3 years that this law is now into place, it has grown enormously, and it has also become a board issue. So that is important as well. So one other word maybe on this link between corporate reporting in itself, of which I just said. It has gone very fast. It is existing all over the world, but not fast enough. So we need a policy framework. One other word now on this beyond GDP and linking the performance of individual companies to a level where you can measure what does all these individual companies at the accumulative level, if you measure them up, what does it mean in terms of the national account, and do the old GDP concept actually, is it valid to measure corporate sustainability performance? Well, of course not. A lot has happened over the years, and of course we can sense a kind of fatigue over this beyond GDP, Stiglitz working groups, but I think that Rio is going to be a very good momentum to actually say, okay, let's have these two movements together. Now that we have this huge momentum of corporate reporting, even connected to integrated reporting, let's also use all this knowledge that has been created on this beyond GDP work. And there are a couple of countries, and I know specifically of Italy and of the Netherlands, where they have formed they have done really interesting work, where they have used their own bureaus of statistics to actually look at all the information that these statistic bureaus already have, and actually check them, compare them with the GRI indicators and the information that has been collected from companies. But nobody knows about this work, so I think there's a lot of groundwork happening. I don't know enough about what's going on in the UK, but I think this coalition can actually use the argument to say these things have to go hand in hand, and then under the conceptual or strategic framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because if you can measure at a national level and you can measure at a company level, but if you don't know where you should be going for in terms of Sustainable Development Goals, then you miss a kind of normative framework. And I think that's what Camilla is going to talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Just checking if everybody's not too hot. It's getting rather warm, isn't it? I don't know if you've got any door. We've got the problem, if we turn the fan on,
we can take off our jackets.
We can't hear everybody, or we can take off our jackets. Okay, so we've got a real sense of how the corporate agenda is emerging, and how reporting is developing a critical mass. And what's quite interesting is that often in the sustainability agenda, there's a lot of criticism about business, but my observation is there's much more reporting at a corporate level than there is at a beyond GDP at a national level. So with that segue, putting Farouk on the spot, thank you very much for stepping in and telling us a little bit about GDP and where it's up to and how this integrated idea works.
My pleasure. As Oliver mentioned, I'm not Derek Osborne, President of Stakeholder Forum. I'm simply his understudy, but sadly without any of the studies, so please be gentle on me. My name is Farouk. I'm the Head of Policy and Advocacy at Stakeholder Forum. We've been doing a lot of work on Rio over the last little while. Just for those of you who don't know, Stakeholder Forum is an international organization who seek to advance sustainable development at the intergovernmental and global levels. So more specifically, we act as the bridge between civil society and these intergovernmental processes, for example, Rio+20, to ensure that there is a full and fair representation of the civil society voice within these processes. So moving swiftly on, apparently rumor has it that in Einstein's office in Princeton, there was a sign behind his desk which says that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted, which pretty much sums up the challenges that we're facing with this agenda at the moment. More recently, Stiglitz, as we mentioned a few times, was commissioned by President Sarkozy to look at how to measure social and economic progress beyond conventional measures. He came up with a number of recommendations, all of which are excellent, not least the fact that GDP and even well-being is simply a snapshot in time. You know where you are, but not necessarily where you're going. And the addition of sustainability into the argument adds a more interesting element, which can tell you basically, if you cut down all your forests and eaten up all your fish, your current levels of wealth will be very high. But of course, you are imminently heading towards a crash because the ecosystem services on which your society therefore relies on are completely depleted beyond the ability to regenerate. And this idea of sustainable development, which looks at the longer term trends, gives you a greater insight into where your society really is and what prosperity really means for your society. And of course, it brings in this element which is fundamental to sustainable development, this idea of intergenerational fairness, so that we don't have the right necessarily to make ourselves rich in a snapshot in time while sacrificing future generations' ability to do the same. This is the foundation for the original definition of sustainable development by Dr. Brundtland in 1975, the Brundtland Commission. 75, is that right? I made that. 87. It's 25 years. Sorry. So moving on, more concurrently, Rio Plus 20, what's happening there? Segal Forum has done an analysis of the submissions to the Rio Plus 20 zero draft document from all the different stakeholders, which includes member states as well as civil society organizations, UN bodies, and even political groups such as the EU. For Beyond GDP, the term, we found that 31 submissions included this term, of which only 2 were member states, of which, surprisingly, well, Croatia's not a surprise, given that they were the EU presidency at the time. The surprising one is actually the United States of America was the only other country to mention Beyond GDP. We need to do a hell of a lot more analysis to figure out why that is and why they're the only ones. However, I must say that we did an advanced phraseology search, so it just looks for Beyond GDP, so it could actually be that the American said, I hate Beyond GDP. I'll get back to you guys on that one. Within the zero draft itself, which is now being published based on the submissions which came in, which formed a compilation document of around 2,000 pages, they came up with a zero draft document, which is the starting point of the negotiations, which is with 19 pages. It's since swelled. And they actually came out reasonably strongly on this Beyond GDP concept, where they said that whilst it doesn't use the Beyond GDP term specifically, it did say that it does make a recognition of the limitations of GDP as a measure of well-being, and it goes on to agree that further development and strengthening of indicators complementing GDP. However, it doesn't actually say that we need to go beyond GDP, which comes up to this key problem that we still have, which is that GDP is simply a measure of economic productivity of a country. And what it doesn't actually measure is this idea of what everything else is going on. And there are 2 key elements that I think everyone should understand about sustainable development. If you actually understand these 2 things, you can apply it to almost any solution to come up with a reasonably good sustainable solution. One is that we live on a small rock floating in space with not a hell of a lot else coming in. The only thing that comes in from that is the energy from the sun. Second thing is, therefore, we need to actually share fairly and equitably the resources which are on the planet, something I've already touched on. This idea that we need to sort of measure these things in a deeper way is something that we haven't really seen yet. And this kind of transcends into what should be a vision for Rio, which we haven't quite seen yet, which is this idea that there are environmental limits or planetary boundaries, or however you'd like to describe them. I actually don't really care, as long as they're explicitly acknowledged and mentioned, within which we need to have a certain limit of fairness, which everyone needs to be above. And it's something our colleagues at Oxfam have been working on quite prevalently to sort of define this safe and just operating space in which we all must exist, and which we sort of social protection for, which we all must remain above. Which therefore, knowing these 2 things as the basis of sustainable development, why we can't measure these things is somewhat at a loss for me anyway. These 2 things, if we are serious about this agenda, we must come up with indicators for measurement as soon as possible. So at the moment, we are heading towards imminent crises of multiple sorts, not least economic, but environmental crises and all sorts of issues, and we'll see really serious issues in the future, which will be around not just the idea that some people will be poor, but there will be wars over these resources because we haven't shared them equitably. So this brings us to the issue of the UK government, or national. So So what's going on in the UK? Caroline Spellman last week made her government's position known in her speech to stakeholders. It was done in the City of London at the Guildhall, which kind of says it all, I think, given that was the venue. It was, very heavily geared towards this idea of green growth. Sustainable development and green growth are sort of one and the same in very interchangeable terms. She didn't use the terms beyond GDP, she talked about GDP plus, which again maybe is a reflection of what's already in the zero draft. We're looking for complementary measures rather than a re-envisaging of what we actually are trying to measure and what we value as a socioeconomic system. And there is a risk here where I think that green growth can be taken as the agenda for the green economy, which won't necessarily deliver what we're really talking about here and what we're talking about. Very much on the green economy side, looking at prosperity for all within one planet limits. So there's a risk there, and I just want to flag that so everyone can be aware of it. And apologize to any colleagues from the UK government in the crowd. But really, what this comes down to in Rio +20 stuff is looking at a vertical alignment from top to bottom, where we start with, again, this vision of what we were trying to actually achieve at Rio, which is then drilled down into this beyond GDP things, which we can measure very clearly at the national level, bearing in mind that there is not really any such thing as a global economy. It's merely just a patchwork of regional economies, of country economies. So we need to be very clear at the national level what we're trying to achieve and the economic ship that we're steering. Where are we heading? Beyond GDP gives a very clear understanding of these issues. We can then drill down into preparing national accounts for how we measure these things, which then can get into this idea of corporate accountability, because if you have a national account based on sectors, you can also assign budgets within those accounts to both corporates, public sector, and even to individuals. And this idea of carbon budgets or individual carbon budgets has come up in the past. I don't think we should get into it. It's quite a contentious topic. If everyone should have a personal carbon budget and work within that limit. And we then sort of get into this idea of values, and I think this is something else that we need to bear in mind in this discussion. Because when we talk about beyond GDP, what we're really talking about is valuing what matters to us. And it can't simply be a top-down arrangement which is foisted upon people. It needs to be complemented with a bottom-up groundswelling of really determining what it is we do value, whether it is personal well-being and prosperity, or whether we value environmental and planetary health as equally important into that arrangement. And only then, when we come from a proper top-down framework, complemented with a sort of really deep groundswelling of deciding what's important to all citizens on the planet, even those not yet born, can we really determine how we are going to measure what we value. So, last but not least, I would leave you with this argument that the Stern Review in 2005 mentioned that it would cost 2% of GDP now, or in 2005 I guess, to combat climate change, and up to 20% of global GDP to deal with climate change if it did happen. My argument would be actually that if you actually did sustainable development properly, it wouldn't actually cost you anything, and the benefits you received in return would greatly outweigh the costs in economic terms that you would have put into delivering stuff. So, very last thing is that we would encourage everyone to consider that the green economy is the green and fair economy. If we are talking about measuring what matters, we need to be very clear in the terminology that we use, that this is not just a green economy, it's not just a greening agenda, but it's very much about social equity and social justice as well. Elliot.
Wow, you stepped in. You did well. Goodness me. Thank you very much. Fabulous. So that sense of a vision that we all aspire to, the sense of Rio should compel people to describe where we want to go. I think that's probably why potentially why the Sustainable Development Goals have almost been seen as a proxy for that space. I don't know. Well, certainly let's now move into why that is being attractive to so many organisations at the moment, what it means, and how it fits in with everything we've so far heard. Camilla, thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Oliver. And I realise there are a lot of people in the room that have their own knowledge and ideas about what we should be hoping for from Rio, and in particular what the Sustainable Development Goals might look like. So I'm not going to say very much, because I think it would really be good for us to have a bit of a discussion. For us, like many of you, we see Rio as a really important staging point in this we've got on the agenda two particular strands that are meant to provide the focus for the Rio agenda, that's to say, making progress on a green economy and trying to get better governance at global, regional, national and local levels. I, like Farouk, am slightly worried by the fact that nobody really seems to be arguing against green economy, which makes me think that it's not, at the moment, got nearly enough bite. I'm a little bit worried also at the relative lack of energy, knowledge, activity, particularly from citizen groups, from the press, who say, oh, damn Olympic Games, you know. What are we going to say about Rio? We're going to be a bit busy with all of this other stuff which is going on. So I'm really keen that we try and find a fairly clear, simple narrative around what we hope for from Rio that we can collectively buy into. And it seems to me that we need to combat both a sort of fatigue with UN process and also a sense that we're in a financial crisis. We shouldn't be talking about green stuff, for heaven's sake. So certainly on the UK front, I think we've got a big job in terms of changing mindsets in the politics and also in the sort of general public awareness of Rio. But increasingly it seems to me that there is a bit of a snowball developing around the idea that Rio won't actually agree a set of global sustainability goals, but will be the kicking off point for maybe a 2 or 3 year process whereby we get agreement on both identifying and mapping out what these global sustainability goals might comprise. I find it hugely heartening that we've got a country like Colombia very much driving this process. I think what this tells me is that there's a new energy in multilateralism and in adherence to UN principles and arenas that we haven't seen for some time. There's a whole body of countries who aren't members of the G20, but who feel that they've got something really important to contribute in this middle income group of countries, and they want to be part of that. We've got this opportunity between now and 2015 to think about how we can help frame a set of goals that we can design and agree collectively that will weave into and run alongside what may happen in terms of next steps for the Millennium Development Goals that have provided quite a useful focus for trying to make significant progress on basic access to health, education, water, addressing hunger and poverty. You may well say not enough progress, and I'd agree with you, but it has at least provided some level of focus for people within the multilateral system. The world today is hugely different from the world of the late 1990s when the MDGs were thought up and put together as a more coherent set in advance of the Millennium Declaration. And I think that means that the process by which the goals are identified and designed also needs to be a very different process. So, what do we think those goals should cover? And I'd be really keen to get a sense from you as to, what should we go for? Should we go for a dozen global goals? Does that sound right? If you had to choose a dozen global sustainability goals, what do you think they should cover? Well, it probably would inevitably be a bit of apples and pears. I think we should definitely have something on equity. We've definitely got to continue, I think, some of the emphasis on access to education, to health, to water, hunger and food needs to be in there. We need to weave in the climate change, mitigation, adaptation elements. I think we've got to do something on oceans. The way we manage our oceans collectively seems to put us at a very great risk of problems around, well, obviously, fish stocks in particular. Should we have a global sustainability goal around urbanisation? Forests, soils, land rights, governance, accountability, energy.
It's more than 12.
I was just thinking, well, maybe we could stretch to 15, but we don't want too many, because we know that when we've got too many of something, it's really difficult to make progress. So we need to identify what those goals might be, and then we need to think about, okay, so suppose we had a sustainability goal around equity. How? Who should design that? Should it be people at the top of the heap, or should it be people at the bottom of the heap? Or what kind of mix of people would you want to pull together to help think through what that goal might comprise? And then how might we set about some of the metrics that would help you know whether you're going forwards or backwards? So I guess my proposition would be that let's try and see if we can have, from Rio to 2015, working through a set of particular areas where we think those goals need to be set up. And there'd be this mixture of biophysical, planetary boundary type goals with the more socioeconomic basic needs, fundamentals of life type of goals. What we've found is that it's often helpful to set up these learning groups. We do learning groups both at a national and at a global level, and it pulls in a range of people, ideas, thinkers, think tanks, people from business, people from government, people from a whole range of different backgrounds, and you collectively agree the task to be done and who's going to do what and how you're going to plan and manage your work. So some kind of set of global learning groups, I think, would be one way of taking this forward. And that would mean that you don't have to have everybody in the room. This doesn't have to be an exercise with 194 state representatives trying to work out what these goals might look like. In fact, I think that would be a disaster. So we've got to come up with something that would allow progress to be made, allow a sort of a sense of that big global vision that we need to achieve, but with something really quite grounded and doable at the national and local level. I wasn't in Rio 20 years ago because I was, at that point I thought, although I was here at IDEA, not another global meeting. What I'm really happy about is working very much at a sort of national to local level. I also have 3 small children and I thought that's kind of more important, spending time with them. But this time around, I really want us to be at Rio. I think that the state of the planet is so parlous and the lack of ambition is so striking that not only do we have a right to be there, but I think we've also got a huge responsibility to be there, to make a noise both there and in advance as to the sorts of changes that we need to see happen. I'm very struck when I think back to that time 20 years ago at how much has changed in terms of our assumptions. Back then, maybe because it was 20 years younger, I thought government was a progressive, well-informed, far-sighted institution able to act for the collective good. I think what's happened since then has been this kind of sense that very often government is the shortest sighted, the least well informed, and the least benevolent, captured by a particular set of interests who are the ones that, you know, pay the bill for running the party political campaign. Can anyone think of a really progressive, ambitious government? Denmark. Colombia. Yeah, okay, that's two. Brazil. Yeah. Yeah. Brazil has done great things, you're absolutely right. But I suppose what I realise is that we live in this kind of second best universe. We have a model of how things ought to be, and actually we are so far from that model. It's a much messier, more difficult universe in which we find ourselves. So I think what we need to do is to recognise the fact that you know, we need to make progress where we think we can. We need to put in actors, be they corporate, be they people from think tanks, from civil society groups, from social movements, from those bits of government that really want to make a change, and see how together we can seize the agenda so that hopefully in 2015 we've come up with something that's got broad buy-in. So that's my proposal for what we should seek from Rio in June. And I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts as to how we might do that.
Camilla, thank you very much. So we've hopefully brought you up to speed on where corporate reporting is, where the Beyond GDP agenda is, where the SDG agenda, and we've hopefully put in your mind this idea that they may be mutually reinforcing, not separate entities for different bodies who sit in different rooms to think about their agendas, but something that we can potentially imagine a system where the corporation gets rewarded by creating environmental benefit or societal benefit. That a nation state, we identify those nation states that are moving progressively on improving their own environmental conditions and how much they draw down for other environment of other countries. And at an international level, we have started to see, we have a consensus that we all rely on a healthy natural planet, and that we all rely on sharing fairly in order to avoid the consequences of those who have and those who have not coming into conflict. So that is our proposition to you. I know that there are some real experts in the room, and I imagine that you were desperate to have it going, but maybe just, I'm sorry to Stephanie draw on you. Aviva have taken a really strong position on this, which within the current climate of banking and financial situation we all actually finance, it's a real breath of fresh air, and you should be applauded for it. I was just interested to know what promoted such a strong position within Aviva.
Everybody hear you?
Everybody hear me?
Yeah.
I think it's a great, it is a great opportunity. I think we are at a point where there is definitely an emerging consensus around the power that things like, kind of reporting can have, the importance of things like sustainable development goals, the importance of reframing the way we think about, the economy, what it means to be humans on this planet and how we operate. I think the point that's been raised before around for a sustainable economy, it needs to operate within environmental boundaries, it needs to satisfy certain sort of social, equitable conditions, is something that Aviva's looked at both as an investor, but also as an insurance company. Obviously, we look at the long term, we look at how long people live, we look at climate change and the impacts it has in terms of how we underwrite what we're, the business that we do, the products that we offer. For us, I think reporting, it may sound often sort of apocalyptic images that Farouk, I think, very helpfully conjured up. Reporting may seem like quite a small step, but I actually think, drawing what Teresa said about the kind of potential transformative power of reporting, actually we do see that companies that start looking at this, that start measuring what the impacts are, that start reporting on what that means for them as businesses, and that then becomes apparent to shareholders who ultimately control flows of capital, enable companies to either grow or not grow, to do, to operate, not to operate, I think can be extremely powerful in terms of actually driving some of this change, driving the high level goals that we'd like to see. So as investors, we think this information is important for the companies. It's important for us investors to understand how companies are positioned for the future, positioned in the long term, and that's why we'd like to see companies reporting on material sustainability issues and integrating that into their reporting, because we see that as a way of integrated into company corporate decision making.
Thank you very much. Let's open this up a little bit more for our participants. Ed, we have some questions. Thank you.
My name is Michael Warhurst. I'm from Friends of the Earth. It's a very interesting discussion. We've been doing a lot of work in recent years on, in some ways, trying to answer a simpler question, which was how to measure resource use. Because partly you ended up with lots of arguments, academic arguments on how to do it, and also people promoting different approaches or just measuring number of tons. We've been doing work at EU level, eventually came up with 4 indicators: overall material use, land footprint, simple footprint of land, water footprint, and carbon footprint. And all of these can work on a product, or they can work on an economy. And we're getting there with DG Environment in the Resource Efficiency Roadmap published in September. They essentially endorse this approach. There's still a way to go. Because I think one of the things that I'm very aware of is that some things are very easy to say and very difficult to do. Beyond GDP is fantastic. GDP works really well because it adds up a lot of things measured in money. If you take our indicators, how do you add them into one number, which is what some people want to do? If you say, well, let's multiply land by 12, carbon by 3. So you do get this big problem, and I can see the desire, there's always this desire for perfection versus the reality. And I think this thing about Sustainable Development Goals, Millennium Development Goals, the big difference is Millennium Development Goals, to an extent, could be, as far as I understand, achieved through aid. We give you lots of money, you can achieve your goal. Sustainable Development Goals are going to have to be achieved through changes in what we do, which is going to be a lot more difficult. So I think it's very important to have these agendas linking up and to be doing the common things, but I wonder if a lot of the time the sort of first thing to do is to do the simple ones we know we can achieve, rather than hoping that just by asking a question we'll achieve an answer on it.
Oh, we're off and running. We'll take a few and then we'll just get a panel discussion.
Hello, Sam Abdullah from the New Economics Foundation. I really like what you were saying, Farouk, about the limits, and I think the combination of and highlighting the fair and green and fair economy is important, because I think it's only when you realise that when you really sort of take seriously the limits that you realise that actually half the problem in the world, okay, part of the problem is poverty, but actually as big a problem is overconsumption, and that sort of you can't tackle one without tackling the other, and so it's really important to bear that in mind. I just wanted to make some points about the beyond GDP stuff, and we've been working on that area since 2001, personally since 2006, and there are a lot of indicators out there. There's a lot of work going on, and we're doing a review at the moment for the European Commission called Brainpool, which is looking at how these alternative indicators are or not getting involved in policy. and the review had about, I think, about 100 different initiatives. So in a way, I'm not sure. I mean, you know, I work on indicators, so I probably will want to create more as well. But I'm not sure if actually creating more indicators, thinking about developing new indicators, is actually what we need. What we need is something that brings them together in a coherent framework. And Michael there was worrying about sort of combining indicators, which is obviously an issue. But I think what we've found seems to be sensible is a framework whereby you have lots of different indicators which have sort of policy levers and tweaks and all that sort of thing. Then you have a middle level, and then you have some top headline indicators which might bring things together in a horrible way, which scientifically isn't very accurate, but do get the message across, do get the momentum going. And that momentum, I think, is the most important thing. I think it's quite, it upsets me somewhat actually, your analysis which said that only 2 countries mentioned the Beyond GDP agenda, when, I don't know, I got the feeling actually a lot is going on, and then you said Croatia and US. Everything's like, oh, I'm sure there's a lot more countries doing stuff on that. But why did they mention that? Well, I mean, I wonder if one of the reasons is that there isn't enough political momentum behind it. There's a risk that it becomes a technical process. The technical process is necessary, but we need to combine the political process, because if they don't go together, then they're not going to go anywhere. So I'll stop babbling.
Thank you very much. Let's take one more and then talk to the panel. Hello.
Hi.
You say who you are and where you're from.
Sure. I'm Jennifer Wilson from Bain & Company. I have a question for Richard and Teresa. Teresa, you mentioned that 96% of the global 250 are reporting on sustainability, and I'm just wondering, that sounds pretty good, but we know it's not enough, and I'm just wondering if you could comment on what, a successful trajectory would look like for the next 5 years. Trajectory would look like for the next 5 years. What would you really like to see in terms of reporting and transparency in the corporate sector?
Yeah, I'll take the first question. We live in a completely different planet today from the end of the 20th century. Seems to me that the sort of north-south aid recipient relationship is kind of disappearing in front of our eyes. It's a much flatter set of relationships, and one in which countries that felt that they were top dogs are rapidly able to come to terms with the fact that they're not. An awful lot of the things that we need to do on the global sustainability goals front are universal. It's not a question of us telling them what to do and paying for it to happen. It's a question of us agreeing a set of changes to our patterns of life and use of the Earth's resources that are completely universal. However, I think we do have to decide, and this relates a bit to your point, colleague from NEF, that you can have the ideal, which is to collect loads and loads and loads and loads of stuff and have perfect indicators, but actually collecting information is expensive. Managing and treating that information is expensive, and so you have to do this trade-off between what serves as a reasonable proxy in terms of making a bit of progress here and now, versus trying to get the ideal set, which may take a lot of time and money and slowing down. So I'm definitely pragmatic school in the first school. I think that's, things don't have to be perfect, but they have to be pushing us in the right direction. And as long as we can kind of learn as we go along, then it seems to me that's a good job done.
Sorry, we just maybe on. Yeah. Yes, I agree. What we're describing is a change in behaviour at a completely radical level, and it is, however, necessary. And I might have really been quite strong about the challenges, but I don't think I overstated them. And the optimistic part of me, when I am a great optimist, is that the solutions are not beyond us, and they are very well described. It is what's required now is a behaviour change. And for me, again, I can't say it's not, but sustainable development is not a cause for the environment. It's a cause for fairness. The environmental issues that we face are simply a byproduct of unfair behavior that will go on to date. And we really need to grasp and get a hold of this problem of inequity and things like that. And once we tackle these issues in a very small way, you'll be surprised how quickly we can actually come to terms with these big issues. However, I do agree that we need to start simple. We do need to properly value what matters to us. We're talking about ecosystem valuation here. It's an important aspect of this measurement thing. And it's something I actually missed in the alignment, which I should have mentioned. It is a way to sort of say that there is a value in, say, land or even swamp or whatever it is, and that we actually need to be very careful about. The risk behind ecosystem valuation is that when you put a price on something, it can be sold. However, we need to be very clear that in ecosystem valuation, this is something I think the UK government has done very poorly when they have done their work, is that they said there's a value, and that should be seen as the lower limit. The upper limit, the higher value of what we receive from these ecosystem services, is probably beyond our comprehension currently. And what we're measuring is really the lowest limit of the value of these things. Moving on, what you said is, you described as a performance management framework. And you can see the fear in policymakers' eyes when you talk about these, these large sustainable development type goals. They think, crap, we don't know how to measure those things, let alone how the hell are we going to affect them. And what you do need is this opportunity to drill down and give them actual policy levers where they can actually see how they can therefore affect change. And that is absolutely vitally important when you're talking to these people, whether it be ministers or officials, to seriously show that linkage down to a whole framework of measures, from the sort of high-level, unscientific, descriptive goals down to individual indicators. So if they tweak a policy here, you will see a change somewhere over there. That's important. But for me, actually, going back to this point, is it's not just an addition of the current indicators that we have to date. Agenda 21, which is the product, one of the products, I should say, of Rio, the original Rio, is very good, but one of its greatest flaws is that it is based on sectors. Therefore, it describes the siloization of the economy. We still haven't come to terms with an integrated approach, which doesn't look at these things as we do energy over there, we'll do water over here, we'll do food over there. We need a system which cuts across all of that to very clearly show us that there is a vision of how the world works in a brand new way. And the Sustainable Development Goals, even beyond the fact that they'll be a performance management framework, as I mentioned, will describe this. If they are done well, there's already a risk that they're heading down the same track that Agenda 21 went down, which is towards sectoral siloization of our world, which we cannot allow to happen. We need to think a lot better, we need to think a lot braver and a lot bigger than that.
Very good. Soraya, thank you.
Yes, was it Michael from the Friends of the Earth? Yeah. Michael, listening to you, I was thinking also back at the MDGs, and I think you actually pointed out that indeed the MDGs were written for nation states and for how to see how ODA would actually deliver those targets. And I have seen from close also how corporate actors, business, try to actually see how they contribute, and that was a complete failure. So I think your remark triggered actually when you were making this kind of brainstorm, Camilla, on how these targets should look. It should be targets that would be implementable for all kinds of actors, national, but I think also for the corporate level. I think that's an important comment that you made. When you went to talked about your very important conceptual work with the DG Environment in Brussels, and I think that really has enriched the conceptual and the grasp on how to measure. On the other hand, what I think is a risk there, that DG Environment is very much closed up in itself and doesn't reach out to what other important directorates at European Commission are doing, from employment, again, the silo situation that you were talking about, but also DG Internal Markets and employment. But Internal Markets is now looking more from the financial regulation and from the corporate entity as a total, where they are saying that they are looking now at regulation at the European level for companies to disclose the totality of their environmental, social and economic performance. And then I get really disappointed when I see that DG Environment just continues building their indicators and doesn't somehow relate to the other one. So in a way, I think that's a waste of energy. The key word there is, of course, when you talk about hundreds of indicators as materiality, what is really important. Now the question about 95% of the 250 largest companies. That is impressive in itself. Of course, the quality of these reports are very uneven. I think the example of Puma, I don't know if Puma is one of the 250 largest in the world, but I think again, the Puma is an interesting example, though it doesn't really belong to that group. How would it look 5 to 10 years from today? I think that's a really interesting question. I tend to agree with Camilla that it's, first of all, it's important to have more critical mass. So it's for the coming 5 years, more is even more important than better. Of course, better is also important, but that's why we are having this campaign for Rio, that all companies should do it. There's no escape. It should be just as routine as financial reporting. So I think that's the first thing. The second element is that it should be extremely easy to be used by investors, because investors are the important driver of this kind of information. And if companies know that investors are looking at their performance and that they will be punished if they don't report well, then of course they will not be so nervous, so to say, or they wouldn't have this kind of driver. So it would be relevant for investors. And these reports should also very much focus on material issues. And there you have a real dilemma, because you have to look on the one hand on cultural relativism or diversity in the world, which issues are relevant in Africa, which issues are relevant in China or in Europe on the one hand. So you have to have this flexibility where companies with their stakeholders can choose what issues are material. But on the other side of the dilemma, there appear to emerge from this global practice some kind of general issues that are relevant apparently for all companies in the whole world. And then we get really close to the sustainable development goals, but from a completely different angle, and I think that's an interesting one. Although the only one that I missed in your list was the one that Green Economy Coalition has been also promoting, and that's kind of innovative green technology innovations. And I think that's kind of, you could say that's a positive goal, it's more an instrumental goal, but I think that would be an important one for a company. And the last one, maybe, is the ethical dimension of sustainability reporting, because sustainability reporting, you can be a very badly performing company, being very corrupt or wasting natural resources, and being very transparent about it. But if you are not driven by a kind of ethical grounding, being the leader of a company. So strangely enough, this whole field has become, in a way, so technical that sometimes we forget that, if you don't have the right people, the right moral leaders in a company, then, all of this has been wasted. So I think that that's one of the things. We are now building the 4th generation of the GRI guidelines, G4, and this ethical dimension somehow, again, becomes really important.
Richard, if you want to, or we can ask another set of questions. Or?
I'll just add a quick comment on the last question, I suppose. So for me, in terms of how reporting will look in 5 to 10 years, I think there's been a lot of progress, first of all, is the thing to say. And that's been as a consequence of a number of different drivers, and that's a good thing. But to me, reporting is defined by materiality, and materiality is defined by the board quite often, and it's the owners of the business as well, from a corporate perspective. And I think that will be the trend, hopefully, is that actually this is really genuinely a board issue. And if I look, for example, at the World Economic Forum released this report at Davos, they released it every year, the risk report, and just picking out some of the major things they identify: extreme volatility in energy and agricultural prices, mismanaged urbanization, failure of climate change adaptation, water supply crisis, food shortage crisis, critical fragile states. They are all linked. So social issues are linked to environmental issues, are linked to societal risks, geopolitical risks. These are all linked. And I think the linkages are the missing piece of what will convince a board as to materiality. I think that's the issue. So Russia has a drought, the price of wheat goes up, the price of beef goes up, the price of food goes up, doubles. In the Middle East, 40% of your income goes on food, between 40 and 50%, as opposed to between 5 and 10% in this country. So when the price of food doubles, you have a very fragile state. you have social unrest, and to some extent, you have some of the issues that you see. So although you can't say the Arab Spring was caused by water, you can say part of the effect that might have been triggered by that. And then if you go and look at commodity pricing, for example, and you look over the past 100 years to 2001, there's been a 1% real decline in commodity prices. So as we've seen a huge demand, we've had commodities, abundant commodities, to be able to satisfy that demand, abundant raw materials. In the last 10 years, we've had an exponential increase in commodity prices. A lot of that is actually linked to water issues. So, and water issues are linked to climate change, and it's these linkages that aren't necessarily either understood or communicated. And I think that's what I see in the next 5 to 10 years, is they will be better understood, they will be better communicated, and that's when boards will start to pick up on this agenda, and it will become a mainstream agenda. It won't see a separate agenda.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. This idea of linkages, I saw something really interesting emerge from the financial crisis, which is the concept of systemic risk. And now, one of the interesting agendas that WWF and others have pushed for is that the Bank of England should be testing the UK economy about its carbon exposure. See its carbon exposure to carbon. How much of our investments are carbon related, and whether or not that is a carbon bubble that we will have to address at some point. So the idea of systemic risk, of things beyond your normal control being connected and creating a chain of events that then you're influenced on. And I know that Save the Children produced a report today, didn't they? 300 children an hour dying of starvation. And they draw the link to the rise in food prices. Very strongly, commodity issues of that. Let's come over here. Thank you. Hello.
I'm Robin Dickinson from the Biodiversity Footprint Standard Project. I'll just come back to the corporate side of things. I think corporates get it. I mean, share price is basically a discount on future profits, and they understand, for all the reasons you articulated, that profits are now, they need to understand the impacts of commodity or lack of commodity, all of these social things that are affecting them. Therefore, that's why boards will take more and more interest in these things and start to measure these things. And measurement is really a proxy for understanding and action. But I think what's interesting then is to maybe try and apply that at the GDP level, and maybe GDP plus might be sort of a future discount of GDP. Maybe an interesting, instead of going sideways, going forward, is one concept that might be worth interesting to comment on. And the other one is, in terms of, I live in the corporate world, and in terms of understanding at a global basis, the population is growing, and it will stabilise in 4 or 5 decades' time, maybe 9 billion. And maybe in that sort of looking forward to that state and working out poverty and how things are going to be then, and working backwards from there, might be a more interesting place to set targets as opposed to trying to set targets in this ever-moving world, which is in essence driven by population growth. And equality, when the population stabilises, might be quite interesting. And another dimension of that is that half the world is going to grow into this new world, so it has no baggage, so to speak. And the other half of the world has the baggage, it's going to have to change, and it's thinking of those two dimensions. And that's
I'm Julie Still, WWF. I'm an inherent optimist, but I always think when you're being an optimist and trying to make things happen, it's really good to think about the limits that might be going on. So, I hate to say, but there are externalities to metrics and unintended consequences of pushing them. And the reason I'm saying that is because there's one phrase that hasn't been said tonight, which is actually really, really important to this, which is around the impact of SMEs. Because if you look at the UK economy, I would say 40% of GDP as measured at the moment, so let's, however you want to call it. But more important is 50 to 60% of employment. So this is quite a substantial amount of organisations. And the key thing there is recognising throughout all these processes where the hugely positive impacts of corporates and how that might, move agendas forward is recognised. But it isn't a scaled down version within SMEs. And not all SMEs are in the supply chains of corporates. One's looking there at some very, very different approaches which are more probably policy-based than they are trying to internalise for some of those organisations. They can't take on all the things that a big corporate can. So I suppose the final thing is as well addressing the limits of internalisation. But that gives a huge opportunity when limits are recognised by the larger companies to say at this point, okay, we can't do this ourselves, we need other actions. So it creates a massive pressure there. And something that then addresses what you were saying about, you know, governments being a little inactive, it becomes another way to push them.
Thank you, Andrea.
Hello. A lot of these indicators and for sustainability, I mean, they all sound well and good, and you know, things like transparency and accountability and things that a lot of CSOs are very much pushing are great, but it really begs the question to me that there's a big paradox between them and the reality that we live in a demand-led growth economy. And you know, a lot of the discussions that go on night after night about how do we return to growth and how do we boost consumerism and all these sorts of things, they don't really get an entry point into those discussions. And you know, there's this issue about the lowest common denominator, that if for those corporations who sign up to them, very often there's many other corporations who are very willing to totally disregard them and go in and plunder, which is, you know, my sector, looking at the forestry sector, is what's happened since the original Rio Summit. We've seen an unprecedented loss of forests, basically to meet consumerism in the north, and with extinctions to boot. So, you know, I'm just wondering if you have the bottom line of companies is that they will fulfil demand. That's the absolute bottom line. Whether or not you have sustainability indicators, because that is the system that we're in. And for those companies that don't fulfil demand, the bottom line is they will go out of business because of the system that we're in. So, you know, I think that it all sounds good, but the reality since the original Rio Summit shows another picture. And just one example of that, I mean, I don't know, maybe a question to Puma or whatever, but, you know, leather, okay, problems about leather in the future. We've had this huge explosion in the derivatives market, which is basically about insuring against unsustainable products so that you can basically get an insurance company to pay you because there isn't enough leather about. So what I'm saying basically is there are an awful lot of other financial mechanisms out there in the capitalist system that corporations and companies can draw upon, you know, and kind of undermine and get around the sustainability obligations that way. Okay.
So we clearly had to come up with growth sooner or later, so I'm very grateful for you to bring it in and for our wonderful conversations, but the reality is this is the way the system works. How on earth are we going to change it? Very important point about SMEs. I'm sorry Helen from our coalition's gone, or else she would have probably made that point for us. But how do we include that? How do we make sure that this measurement agenda is compatible to the SMEs? And what was the? Oh yes. Now and the idea of how GDP could evolve, and the idea of the measurement could be evolved, and how we could think forward. Who wants to pick off? All right. Okay.
I actually thought some of these comments really tied together, and what struck me is that what's required is a great deal of both intelligence to answering these questions, but also a great deal of sensitivity as well. There are risks in this transition to a green and fair economy, and we need to address these things. So really, the problem with sustainable development is there's no silver bullet. Corporate reporting, measuring what matters is fundamentally won't work without a whole gamut. This is where the intelligence comes in. We need to design a whole new system. What we're talking about is re-envisaging a brand new socioeconomic system which puts both people and the environment at its center. This includes things on fiscal reform, and maybe it cuts across to some of these other points, where we're looking at, changing the fiduciary principle of corporations who fundamentally are tasked with providing profit for their shareholders. But if it's changed from providing profit at the same time as promoting social well-being and respecting environmental limits, it's a different set of targets that we're actually pursuing here, and we're putting towards them. Along with that, you can use taxation schemes, which would benefit SMEs better in the system, which can be positively geared towards good environmental practices, which would definitely benefit all corporations, but also I hope that it could be done quite intelligently to give SMEs the edge in some of these discussions. And of course, the removal of harmful subsidies in which so many large corporations rely on to really make their money. And if we do these things quickly, if we do these things intelligently, with a great deal of sensitivity, which is the fact that these things need to be paced out slowly over time to allow the systems to adapt. If we put in these harsh cuts, as we've seen, it's the smallest and the poorest who inevitably suffer. But if it phased in over time, we can help people adapt and change, which comes into this point of just transition to a green and fair economy, which is as important as what the green economy is itself. And really, it also touches on maybe some of the point of you were trying to make, future discounting rates and working backwards from 2050. And part of the population discussion is it's not just the number of people, it's the demographics of the people that are within it. And it does require us to think very carefully about who those people are and what do they really want in that stage. And of course, if we continue on our path, we're facing not only a growing number of people, but a burgeoning middle class in the developing world, and they're going to want what we've had. So unless we change our values at this point, we are going to suffer this problem, and it's going to continue apace. And actually, population is an exponential growth curve, not even just a linear growth curve, so things will scale worse.
Just briefly, I think it's interesting asking this question about the extent to which you can rely on corporate reporting, and obviously I think what that does, or what that ought to do, is to give governments comfort that they can move into that space in terms of regulation. So that indeed, the SMEs obviously need a different set of incentives and constraints, but those can only come from government saying, well, actually, we see that this is possible. Let's try and find a way in which we can roll that out more generally. I really liked your idea that we should be trying to think about backcasting from 2050, and how to build in some sort of contraction and convergence type approaches within that model.
Richard, come to you.
Yeah, well, just actually to sort of develop that point of backcasting, I think it's an interesting one, because one of the things that we found doing the research that we did for Puma, we researched global production. We researched where it occurred, we researched what the correlations were, for example, between water scarcity and market price of water, and there were no correlations actually. And so, to me, backcasting would be actually saying, what would a good global system look like? Because at the moment we've got an extremely bad one. Who in their right mind would design a system where you make a lot of manufacturing and source a lot of raw materials in China from the 10 driest provinces in China that have the biggest risks, and therefore you have to build a massive water pipeline at great cost to pump water down to those 10 dry provinces. Who in their right mind would design a system where a lot of cattle ranching occurs on what becomes very low value land in places where you're destroying the lung of the planet, especially the Amazon basin. So you have these inequalities in a badly designed system, and I think one of the things that's missing is the right level of information about how the system works today and how probably ideally could work. It doesn't need more data. We've got the big data. We've got plenty of information on production. We know where water scarcity issues are. We know where some of the environmental issues are. The social issues, that's quite apparent. Actually, what it needs is to bring all of that together and to think about what a good system would look like. So, where would you manufacture product? And companies are thinking about this. So, GE, Jeff Immelt, has now insourced. He's now moved a lot of the manufacturing back to the United States because logistics is becoming more expensive as the price of oil rises, security supply, controlling more of the supply chain. You're finding more companies vertically integrating again in ways when they outsourced in the past. And in the past, low cost was great. Now it's not low cost anymore because you've outsourced your ability to control raw material pricing. So actually, what does a good system look like? How would you design it? And I think that's a very good question to ask.
After this visionary comment, I would like to get back to the SME statement from the lady from WWF. I think, and Camilla also referred to it, I think it's a very important one, and we always talk about large corporate entities, whereas all these economies are made up of SMEs. Formal and informal, and especially the informal sector is even more difficult to tackle. Having said that, if we look, for instance, at the European Union, which is becoming bigger and bigger, there is still a lot of discussion that even SMEs should somehow, and they don't know still what kind of system, but in the coming months there will be some kind of proposal that SMEs also should be highly stimulated, they would have a kind of exceptional status to disclose information. So I think that taboo to say, if you're small, it's too much of an administrative burden, I think we have gone beyond that. So, and I think it's good to raise this out also in the context of Rio. It's a difficult one. Having said that, I think quite a lot of SMEs do see reporting on sustainability performance also as a market opportunity, be it in their position as suppliers to companies like Puma, or for exporting, etc. Like for instance, sustainable fruit production or flower production. I don't want to buy roses anymore in the Netherlands because I'm almost sure that they come from Kenya. But if I buy roses from on which it is explained that they have been produced in a sustainable way, of course, individual rose growers could never do that. But what you do see is that you have this collective, not so much at a cooperative level producing, but at the collective level reporting and disclosing that this whole sector is doing an effort. So I think these are ways that we somehow have to bring on board in Rio as well, and not focus too much only on the large companies.
Thank you, very valuable.
Yeah.
We're getting perilously close. I've had the sort of 5 to 7 minute warning. So I'd just like to take one or two final, really, put yourself in that. Would you like to, so a couple more. Yes.
I can, but I don't know if I'll deliver on
The last minutes.
on a punchy thing. So I'm Jessica Rees. I have 2 hats on. One is running the Prince of Wales's Accounting for Sustainability project, and the other is the International Integrated Reporting Council, which we set up with a number of those in the room. So I think it's great to see a few of the themes coming out in the discussion, which we see as very important. One around linkage, and both linkage between the different pillars, and secondly, linkage between how you set the global economy and the framework at an institutional level, through to the national and corporates. I think that there is also the other theme that I really like the way that you mentioned, Rick, around current performance is often focused on where you are now and not where you're going. And certainly you will see that theme being particularly important if some of what we've been talking about tonight is going through.
I can't take credit for it, it was just a sticker saying.
No, absolutely. Well, it's a good man to draw on. In terms of one of the themes that we've got in terms of the linkage aspects that is worth giving a bit more thought to within the zero draft and some of the movements forward is actually how that linkage to the economic pillar can be thought through and maybe strengthened throughout the framework. So I think there's a few hints of that, and at the institutional level, some passing those links need to come through more strongly. But then when you get into things like the Sustainable Development Goals, I think some of the discussion loses any of that sense of linkage and what a truly linked framework would be. I don't think that is easy, but putting some of this in terms of that economic analysis as well and very firmly grounded within planet limits and their society, their economy, I think is something that needs to come out.
Thank you, Jessica. ladies and gentlemen, I think that we've had a very interesting discussion, and I feel more confident with the idea that these things need to be discussed. And I particularly like Richard's point about the WEF report, about the various risks. And I kind of get this sense of whose job is it to manage those risks? Is it a corporate responsibility? Is it government responsibility? Is it international responsibility? This is, building on what Baruch said, this is immensely complex. There's no one silver bullet. And what we need is people understanding what the challenges are collectively and bringing their various levers to it in as coordinated and as structured manner as we can possibly obtain.